Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Preparing Access Services for Deaf College Students, Tips and Resources. My name is Kate Lewandowski. I am a white woman with blonde hair pulled back in a ponytail. I'm wearing a black shirt. My pronouns are she and her. I'm a resource specialist here at the National Deaf Center, or NDC. Now I'll turn it over to my colleague. Hello, my name is Stephanie Zito. Allow me to describe myself. I am a white woman with long brown hair pulled in a ponytail. I'm wearing a black quarter-length jacket and red shirt. I'm in a room with closet doors and an entry door behind me with several pictures on the wall. My pronouns are she, her. Here at the National Deaf Center, I'm also a resource manager. So we're happy you're with us today. Before we dive into our topic today, I want to explain a little bit about National Deaf Center. We are federally funded through the Education Department, through the Office of Special Education Programs. Our mission is to share resources, networking, provide continuing education and training for our audiences. And our ultimate goal is to see equitable opportunities and success for deaf people. We offer guidance, one-on-one support, and help you, our audience, address whatever you may be facing in your profession, working with deaf people. Our primary goal today is to review effective communication and the interactive process with students. Effective communication, according to the Department of Justice, is foundational. The access is foundational to that communication. We want deaf students to experience the breadth of opportunities they'll have on a college campus, and we want them to be successful. But who determines what their success looks like? That's something we will talk about today. As many of you well know, deaf students are not a monolith. They are different in terms of their levels of hearing loss, communication modes, professional and educational interests. And that means accommodations that we provide are not one size fits all. It's important to think about how deaf students have a subjective experience on campus and how they will communicate in different environments across campus. Again, we can't provide access as a one-size-fits-all solution. It's dependent on each individual student. So following the U.S. Department of Justice, effective communication is the equally effective communication, equal to that of people without disabilities. Both Title II as well as Title III entities are legally responsible to ensure effective communication. That means the goal is to provide opportunities for deaf people to communicate in a manner that's equally effective to their hearing peers. This means receiving information and expressing information as well. All right, moving along. And this is Zito. Kate, if I could jump in, do you mind moving back just a little so we can see your hands and arms? Sure, this is Kate. So we have here on the slide some common accommodations that can be effective for a variety of deaf students. Now, this doesn't cover every single possible accommodation that a deaf student may request, but these are some of the most common. You'll see first here, sign language interpreters, professional people who facilitate communication through American Sign Language, transliteration, tactile signs, oral methods, or cued speech. A qualified interpreter can mean that they are certified or they have the right educational experience and content knowledge to really fit the class they're assigned to. Not all qualified interpreters are qualified for every single deaf person or class or event that may come up on campus. And you may experience barriers when it comes to certification and licensure. So it's important as you hire these professionals, you're able to evaluate what type of class is happening, the deaf student, so that you can take the measures to ensure a proper fit. You want to look at maybe an assessment, licensure, certification, or other state requirements that may be in place in your state for hiring professional interpreters. Next on the list is speech-to-text services. That's an umbrella term that we use for different types of real-time speech-to-text. It includes services like CART, CPrint, Typewell, and CART is provided by a trained professional who uses a steno machine. It is a verbatim, word for word text account of what is being spoken. Compared to a service like CPrint or Typewell, which is also provided by a professional using a QWERTY keyboard and who will type what is being said, but not verbatim. Instead, they type a meaning for meaning or concept-based account of what's being said. Next, we see captioned media. That is the display of auditory information in pre-recorded videos or audio through captions. And it includes the spoken dialogue, sound effects, and speaker identification. Next on the list are assistive listening devices, or what we call ALS. They are designed to enhance those speech sounds. Finally, on this list, we have note takers. Note takers record class concepts. And the reason we use note takers is because often deaf students have to mitigate the impact of splitting their attention in class. They may be attending to the professor, the slide presentation, and CART or a sign language interpreter. So note takers help mitigate some of that and capture the information from the class. On to our next slide. All of those services that I just mentioned are common accommodations that you've probably either seen or learned of at some point. But there are many different words used to describe those services, and especially when we talk about captions. When people say captions, it could be real-time captioning, CART, CPrint, Typewell, automatic speech recognition, closed captions. You can see there are a host of words that all are used to describe captioning. So let's talk a little bit more specifically about these different terms and the key differences among them, how those differences impact the student. So you can see we have this divided into three categories: speech-to-text services, captioned media services, and ASR. They each mean something different, and there's a unique quality to each of those categories. Speech-to-text services typically are provided by a human captioner who is there in the environment or listening to the environment. There are professional standards set by their professional organizations. Often that means those providers meet a minimum qualification or must follow code of ethics. Next, when we talk about captioned media services, that is generally for post-production or pre-recorded videos. Now, captioned media can be provided in a variety of ways. It can be taken care of in-house at an institution or by a third-party vendor. No matter where the service comes from, it is expected that captions follow captioning standards. Oh, and I'm being reminded to scoot back a little bit. One moment here. Let me adjust my camera. There we go. We want to ensure whether your process of captioning takes place in-house or through a vendor, that it does meet the standards of equal access with captioning. Our third category is that automatic speech recognition. It is real time. It can also be put on a pre-recorded video. An example of ASR are the YouTube auto-generated captions. ASR can be used as a first step to produce captioned media or an impromptu conversation with a student, a brief impromptu conversation that may happen. ASR does not meet any type of standard of quality, and the quality can vary greatly depending on the software or platform.
All right, so with standard captioning, again, we see various terminology used for captioning, same as we have ALS, assistive listening systems, as you can see here on the slide. So there's many different terminologies that can be used. We have FM systems, ALD, Bluetooth, hearing aids. What else do we have? Telecoil, cochlear implants. There's many different types of assistive technologies that are used. And the next slide will expand on what some of those differences are between assisted listening device systems like the ALS or what is considered like a personal device. Next slide, please. Here we have the ALS, assistive listening system. And then we have the personal device, and we'll talk about the differences between the two. Assistive listening devices or systems can be things such as Bluetooth, an FM system or a DM system. FM tends to meet a frequency monitor, and then we have the DM system, we have a loop, we have infrared devices. Now with personal devices, those tend to be devices such as hearing aids, cochlear implants, a BAHA, which could be like a bone connected device or bone conducting device. So with personal devices like hearing aids, cochlear implants, those can be used independently on their own by students who can connect that to a device. If you have the assisted listening system, you can connect that to hearing aids, to your cochlear implant. For the personal devices, it is varied the approach on how you would connect that to your assistive listening systems. Again, with Bluetooth, we are seeing more and more Bluetooth devices come out.
People use telecoil as well. It's dependent on the type of hearing aid or cochlear implant and how that connects to the assistive listening system. Now understand the ALS is considered an auxiliary aid that must be provided by the institution under the ADA.
Compared to the personal listening devices, those would be a student's responsibility to bring and provide for themselves, which tend to mean that students will then work with their audiologist to make sure that they can maximize their personal listening devices to fit their learning experience. The school is responsible for providing the ALS, the assistive listening systems, under the accommodations. With the personal devices, those students are themselves responsible for taking care of that on their own as their own personal equipment. Now, ALS is not, there's not a standard, there's no one fits all again, in terms of what can be connected to a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. It is varied. So it depends on the manufacturer of that ALS device, if it is actually conducive with the hearing aid or the cochlear implant. You'd have to work with the student's audiologist and figure out what hearing aid or cochlear implant they have and how that would work with the ALS device. So there are many types of ALS devices available that do fit with different hearing aids and cochlear implants. And we are seeing quite a large jump in Bluetooth devices. So it is pretty critical to have various types of ALS devices available to try to meet that wide range of your students that you will have. Next slide, please.
So that was a quick review of some common accommodations for deaf students. We here at NDC have a variety of resources that expands on each one of those accommodations. So you can see here on the PowerPoint slide, we have a list of those accommodation resources where you can learn more. Our recommendations are also listed here, so please check this out when you can. And we will be sharing the PowerPoint in the chat box so that you can access these hyperlinks. So when it is ready to share, we will be posting it in the chat box. All right, let's move to the next slide. Okay, so we have already talked about effective communication and what that means, common accommodations for deaf students. So now let's go over the interactive process. How is it that you will know what accommodation is the right fit for a deaf student? How do you determine which accommodation is effective? Well, that goes with having an interactive process with that student at the very beginning. The student is able to share their experience, let you know what auxiliary aids and services they have used in the past. So their background, their history is so important rather than solely relying on documentation. The student is going to let you know what has been effective for them. So it is critical to not only rely on documentation, but rather the student's self-reporting. All right, next slide.
All right. So here at NDC, we have several tools and resources available that go into the process of that interactive process with students and getting their experience with accommodations. We have some great tools and resources for you to use to learn in terms of what a deaf student might need and what the request might look like. So there is a list here that you can see. Feel free to look it over. There are some typical questions that might come up. A few questions that could be considered a request that you might get for this upcoming fall when you're talking with students. We give some examples of that. One example could be, what is your communication preference in a lecture type classroom or in a lab setting? It really would depend on the course and the information that's being provided, and you have to base it off of that. So one student might have different communication approaches based on the environment that they're in. If you have a fast talking professor, then with CART, that might be a necessary accommodation. If it is a small group where the students are doing turn taking, it's a lot of interactive work, an interpreter might be the best accommodation for that part of the class. Another question that could be asked by you to the student could be, what activities are you wanting to participate in? Any extracurriculars outside of the classroom. Some students may need to have maybe group meetings, or they might be required to go to events on campus, or they might be required to participate in field work. And so if they are planning to participate in something outside of the regular scheduled classwork, those will also require accommodations and need to be planned for as well. Moving on to the next slide. All right, so after you've had that interactive session with the students, you've asked them questions about what their communication preferences are. We do have several tips for this process. The first tip would be to ensure that your interaction with deaf students is accessible in itself. Making sure that you do have an access meeting beforehand to make sure you're ready for that interactive process with the student. Making sure that the information is the most accurate and relevant, and make that process as smooth as possible. I also did want to mention that, again, it's not a one-size-fits-all system. Every deaf student is unique and has their own accommodations that will be needed. So those accommodations requests will vary. And a student might not actually know what they're needing at that point in time. They might not be familiar with the different options and resources available to them. So it's important to be flexible and to provide those options for the students, to give them examples of the different accommodations available, or to maybe have them test some out and see which ones are most effective and work best for them. And so prioritize the student self-report. We do emphasize that. We have mentioned that previously. The students know their needs and what their communication access is, what best works for them. So that should be a priority.
We very often see that disability services professionals will solely rely on documentation to discern what the best accommodation might be for a student. It may be a piece of documentation such as an audiogram, but that is measured in a quiet environment that does not emulate that of a classroom environment. So you need to use other approaches such as that interactive process with the student.
So it really is key to listen to the students and what they're telling you their needs are. We do also notice that sometimes people will think that they're going through the process, so that means that the prior semester someone has already talked with the student, they've already gone over all of these, so now we're done. We don't have to do it again moving forward. But this interactive process is ongoing. It should happen all throughout the student's university experience. It is really important that after a semester begins and you've established this, to have a check-in and to see how everything's going with the accommodations provided. If the student feels like it's working for them, they're getting equal access or not. Sometimes the student might not reach out to you or might not think that they're able to. They might realize that that wasn't really an option available to them. So it is important for yourself to get in contact with them directly and ask how it's going. Next slide. All right, now so for determining accommodations, again, there are varied approaches in deciding what would be the most effective accommodation for communication. Again, the Department of Justice talks about aids or services that are needed for effective communication. That means you have to consider the nature of it, the length, the complexity of the material, the environment, communication, as well as the student's typical approaches for communication as well. For these accommodations, you really, again, want to include the student in this. And for determining accommodations, it's not just based on the institution's finances or budget and what the ability is there. It's going to be based on the student's needs first and foremost. If you're wondering why reasonable accommodations are needed or what would be the best fit for that specific student, we do have an equal access guide that we can provide for institutions to look over and to have available for them so they know what they're responsible for providing.
OCR, or the Office of Civil Rights, points to looking at the deaf student's idea of effective communication according to their subjective experience.
I'm going to turn it over to Zito now.
Okay, this is Zito. I'm trying something new for me. I uploaded the PowerPoint PDF there in the chat box so that you have access with all of the links, and everything will be listed there. If you need a copy sent to you, please let me know. Thank you so much, Kate, for explaining all of those differences in the types of accommodations and the interactive process and what effective communication means. Now we're going to start tackling the questions that came in from your registration. And let's start with this next slide. The question asks, what information and resources should we include for instructors before the beginning of the semester? I have to say, this is a great question. I feel like we give a lot of information to faculty at the beginning of the year, but it is necessary to give them guidelines, how to interact with the deaf student, the service providers who will be in their classroom, and tips on how they can create an inclusive classroom environment. You can also include this into your processes. You can let the faculty member know how to request captioning services, how to request other interpreting services and things such as that throughout their semester. You can also do service provider introductions. Some teachers may have never experienced using something like an interpreter in their classroom, and they may be unsure how to interact with this new person that's in the room. Sometimes you may want to remind the faculty members that these access providers would need access to the learning management system, the syllabus, and other reading materials that are used in the classroom. So let's look at the next slide. This slide highlights some of the resources we have available to help you educate faculty on using accommodations, having a deaf student in the class, and how to create an inclusive classroom environment. We also include a link here to Deaf 101, which is a basic course in how to interact with deaf people and get some more information here. These could be good for faculty to look over, and that Deaf 101 course could be a great one for faculty to take before they have a deaf student in their class. You know, we're noticing a trend in the field where disability services sometimes will send a letter to faculty, and sometimes they are passing on that responsibility to the student to send a letter to the faculty member. If that is your practice to give that responsibility to the student, I would at least provide a template to be used with that student and faculty, and we have those tips here. Let's look at the next slide. This question asks, what types of test accommodations are common for deaf students? And let's talk about that with the next slide. On the slide here, we see some testing accommodations. It's case by case, sometimes test by test, depending. So what we have seen commonly used are things such as extended time, where the student has extra time to complete their test. One of the most hotly debated issues with testing accommodations are interpreters, and what the interpreters are allowed and not allowed to interpret. And the answer to that is it depends. It depends on the situation. It depends on what's the purpose of the test. What is it testing or measuring? Is the test measuring English competency, reading ability, and comprehension? If that's the case, the interpreters may not be considered a reasonable accommodation. It may be a fundamental alternative that is needed instead. So when you think about what the test measures, that will kind of guide what type of accommodation is there? Is it a knowledge of history, content? Is it a lab where you have to demonstrate a learned skill or show that you're able to practice a skill? It's definitely reasonable to have an interpreter in those situations. So it is case by case. A few other accommodations, and they can, again, vary depending on the test and the student and their needs, but some other accommodations are listed here. A tip that we can give you is to really talk with the instructor. Make sure that you understand what that instructor is measuring. How is the test formatted? And how can you provide a deaf student equal access to that test? If videos are a part of the test, will the video be captioned? What other accommodations may be needed? Some students may want to use an assistive listening device during a test, a word bank or note cards, or a transcript from an audio recording, if they're having to answer questions based on something that they watch or listen to with audio. So again, the type of accommodation depends. Let's move to the next slide. And I see a clarifying question here about word banks and note cards, what they might be used for. There are many students with certain disabilities that use a word bank or a note card, depending on their situation. It can be helpful for a deaf student in a way like, for example, a history class. If that student has received all of their concepts in ASL through a sign language interpreter, the word bank is there not to give answers, but to trigger the concept that they've seen over and over in American Sign Language, but not in English. So that language access can be a barrier, and something like a word bank can help trigger their memory of a concept so that they can answer a question appropriately. Hopefully that answers your question, but again, the type of accommodation used is heavily dependent on the context and the student. Here are several more resources we have about testing accommodations, test accessibility, why interpreters are reasonable accommodations, and why they're important to deaf students. Okay, let's move on to the next question, please. Another good one, this asks, are remote service providers like interpreters or speech-to-text service providers appropriate for all classes and social events? You know, we get a similar question in a variety of ways here at our help desk about these remote service providers. So let's discuss it at the next slide. Remote services can be very useful and can be a good fit in certain situations, but we would not say for all situations. As you've heard us say over and over again, it really depends on many things, including the environment. So the left-hand column here explains what remote services can be very useful for. Virtual meetings such as this webinar. You know, Kate and I are not in the same place. We're not in the same place where the interpreters are. So this is an example of remote services being appropriate. Think about live streaming, classes that are virtual and things such as that. That could be great. Access for an in-person event, but with remote providers could be appropriate in situations with limited service provider availability. If something is, if a provider is off campus. Sometimes it's beneficial in rural areas, but if there are a lack of qualified professionals in that area, remote services could be great for that. It's also good for fulfilling last-minute requests. Remote services can definitely fill that need, especially if there are a lack of available professionals in that rural area, especially as a last-minute need. Sometimes remote services are professional if you're looking for a very specific qualification in a service provider. We have seen that in medical programs, legal programs on campuses, highly technical programs or foreign language courses. You may benefit from remote services in order to get a provider like an interpreter or speech to text who's well-versed in that area. Now, we do have some important considerations and why it's not an appropriate fit for everything. Student readiness is important to consider. Will the student advocate for themselves? If there's a loss of technology or if there's a problem, are they ready to manage that if technology stops working? It's also important to consider the infrastructure of technology. It may not work well. Suppose you have a deaf student who uses tactile interpreters. Well, of course, remote interpreting will not be effective in that case. The technology infrastructure is a major consideration when you're looking at your campus environment or whatever the location may be where there is a need. You must have very reliable internet in order to maintain that service provider's connection. Is it a good microphone system and sound system in the room so that the provider can hear everything going on in that room? You also have to think about classroom management systems. Is the teacher able to manage all that's going on in that room? Does the teacher have the ability to manage student turn taking so that the provider is able to capture each speaker? The third bullet point here is dynamics in the course. Some courses by nature are very dynamic, very interactive, and those don't always work well in a remote setting. If there's a lab or a highly visual class, such as a math class where 99% of the content is up on a board in the room, it may not make sense to have a remote service provider who's not able to see and capture the entirety of what's going on visually in that classroom. Again, the course itself will heavily influence your determination of if a provider should be remote or not. Lastly here, we can't stress enough how important it is to have a backup plan when technology fails. We know it fails, and when it works, it's great, but it can fail and backup plans are necessary. All right, let me share the next slide that shows some resources where you can really dig into remote services. So these are just a few of our resources we have available for you. Next question. The question reads, any advice when a student repeatedly does not show up for class and interpreters or speech to text providers have been scheduled? Whew. We get this question often. First and foremost, it is so important to keep in mind that deaf students will have personal and familial emergencies. There are situations that affect students' ability to get to class on time, or they may just decide to skip. They may decide to cancel going to class. So cancellations and no-shows will happen, and we know that you're still required to pay your service providers if they happen within a certain time. Now, for frequent cancellations or frequent no-shows, it really triggers a time to sit down and talk with that student. Find out what is going on that leads them to not attend class and not communicate in advance. Maybe they have a reason for not communicating in advance and they need to email rather than whatever the structure may be on campus to communicate their cancellation. So ask them about their preferred way to communicate their schedule changes to you. It's also possible that the accommodations request isn't really what the student needs in that situation. So you can chat with them to make sure that things are going okay with their service provider. And is that a cause of why they may not be attending class? And if so, change that approach. You could also book service providers per class if you have a frequent person who's frequently no-showing. There is some risk to doing that, though. If you switch to a by request only instead of booking an interpreter for a full semester, you will run the risk of not having consistent interpreters or not having the availability, and that will definitely have an impact on the student. That interpreter or service provider won't have prior content knowledge that someone who is consistent throughout the semester will gain. If you make last minute requests, there is a high risk that that assignment won't get filled with a service provider. So I think it's important to clearly communicate expectations and policies, not only with the student, but with the provider. Sometimes we understand that there's frustration in having to pay a provider, but it's important to look maybe at the types of providers you're using. Do you use staff? Are they teaming with another service provider? If that class gets canceled or the student doesn't appear to be there, then can that service provider go fill another need on campus before they head home? So that can help mitigate some of the cost concerns you have when a student cancels or doesn't show up for class. All right, let's move to the next.
Again, here's another list of some resources, some prior case laws that delve into the requirements, and if you decide to have a cancellation or suspension of services. So there are some policies that are cleared up here in the links we've shared. Someone is asking about a reasonable cancellation policy. Like the industry standard is 48 hours prior to the event. So that would be considered kind of a standard cancellation policy, 48 hours notice. Again, there are some guidelines here in the resources available that you can look over. Next slide, please. This question is asking about, can auto captions be considered an accommodation? Well, I just want to throw out maybe some other questions that we get about this topic as well. We do have folks ask us about, can automated captions replace CART services or other STTS systems? They're more cost effective compared to CART services or any of the other options available, in terms of reducing cost to budget. So we get those questions quite frequently. And it's a tough conversation to have. And we understand why. We know budget is always a consideration. But it is not the determining factor behind reasonable accommodations and why you should pick a certain accommodation over another. The determining factor should always be the most effective communication for that student.
And do remember, the concept of undue financial burden lies within the entire institution. It's a school-wide responsibility and not determined only by a departmental budget. So you may need to have some conversations about administrators on who pays for different types of accommodations. OCR has shown through legal cases that auto captioning is not considered an equitable accommodation.
And we know that the other options are not cheap. We know that budget is a factor, but it is put into law that you are required to provide them, and lawsuits are also not cheap. So that's something to consider. So ASR technology, we do not recommend for classroom and student learning environments, whether it be online, remote work, or in person. Sometimes people think that for remote work, it might be a good option to utilize, but it's still not the best accommodation. ASR is just so unpredictable, and there are so many inaccuracies. It's so varied in the situation. And again, remember, the students are relying on that for their tests they have to take later on. So how can they effectively take their tests if the vocabulary that they're being fed from the ASR is not accurate to the test material? It could be beneficial for, again, some last minute impromptu meetings, maybe like an RA in a dorm. Let's have a quick conversation. They're having a very short conversation, informal. That could be beneficial in that situation. But for classroom settings, it really is not effective. And you need to have a conversation with that student. If they do say that they themselves prefer ASR, that's what they're asking for. Again, make sure that they understand the risks with that communication method. And if they accept those risks, then that needs to be documented. We'll move on to the next slide, please. Again, some more resources about automatic speech recognition. We have some evidence-based strategies, why ASR is not effective. It delves into that. So please review these links if you are wanting more information about automatic speech recognition. Someone's asking about different phone apps, if that can be used for some impromptu last-minute conversations. And there are many apps available out in the market. So if you have accommodations available, or if you're able to, book a meeting with a student in advance, again, just make sure you have that effective communication. That should always be the top priority. Next slide, please. This questioning is asking, is it common practice to provide both CART and ASL for all classes at the same time? And yes, there are some situations where you are providing both an interpreter and a CART system or an STTS, where it is most effective. We do see this come up quite often. Again, it requires that interactive process, talking it over with the student, making sure that they're understanding the environment, what the, they want to know what the nature of that learning environment is going to be, and how to determine what's best appropriate. And both might be the answer in a certain case. Again, it's all going to be case by case, and also class by class. Every course is different. Again, it's really not a one size fits all in terms of the courses and the accommodations. Some common courses that we do see these dual accommodations provided in, where it's most effective, might be for foreign language courses, for very highly technical courses, anything in like the STEM world, medical programs, things like that, with very specific technology. And if you have more than one deaf student in the classroom as well, then you might need more than one accommodation to fit all of those students. Next slide, please. Here are some more in-depth resources and information about dual accommodations for you. Move on to the next slide. I know that we are running out of time, so I'm trying to move through these questions. What are special accommodation considerations for medical, nursing, health science major programs? There are many resources available about this topic. So we'll move on to the next slide. Again, you may see dual accommodations come up in these scenarios. Qualified service providers, again, is key. If you have an interpreter or an STTS system, they would need to know that medical verbiage, be familiar with that environment. Clear masks are often used, especially when you're transitioning to clinical and internship environments. Amplified and digital stethoscopes. That's another accommodation that can be considered for deaf medical students. Move on to the next slide. We have our resources here. The top link that you see goes in depth, deaf medical students and healthcare majors. It's got a nice checklist for, when they're preparing for clinical and internships. It's similar to that interactive process checklist, but this is very specific to the medical student environment, what to look for and what to prepare for in those specific environments. Let's move on to the next slide. We have a question here asking, where can I get recommendations and referrals for technology and service providers? And move on to answer that in the next slide.
So the National Deaf Center cannot endorse or recommend any specific brand or company, but we have a fantastic listserv group. If you subscribe to the listserv, you can ask your colleagues there who have experience working with deaf students and providing accommodations to share their recommendations or even contract information that they may have. They can also share information and recommend assistive listening systems, and it's just a great place to share information with your colleagues. Some other idea here is to contact your state office for the deaf and hard of hearing. Often they can give you regional referrals, agencies, and contractors that they may recommend working with. There are also several professional organizations, your state Registry of Interpreters for the Deaf, the SCRA, which is an association of court stenographers. So there are different organizations listed here where you can get more information about professionals you may work with, and they can refer you to specific entities.
I'm going to try to quickly go through the next slide. All right, so we have top 5 tips for the beginning of the semester. 1 is communicate your cancellation and no-show policy. 2 is to establish a request form or process outside of the classroom needs. If a tutor is going to be needed, if there's any other events or any services required, make sure those opportunities are made available and accessible to deaf students. 3rd is to check in with the students. Kate mentioned that before in the presentation, but it's not just a one and done for the semester. You need to check in frequently throughout their college experience. 4 is to have a backup plan, always. Interpreters and service providers can also get sick. We know that in this COVID era, that does happen quite often. And it's not going away, so we do need to be prepared and have a backup plan in place and make sure that we have that available. Many agency contracts, make sure that you have that backup plan set in place so that you're ready for if a last minute request comes in and you need to find a substitute. 5 is contact NDC for support. We are here for you. We can answer more in depth any of your questions. We are happy to have one-on-one appointments with you. Please feel free to send us an email at any time. Please reach out whenever needed.
Okay, I am looking here at questions coming in the chat. I know we had one person who had mentioned assistive listening systems. I'm trying to find that comment. Right, Roger Pens, Roger On, the Connect clips. Yes, those are considered assistive listening systems. They're typically paired with a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. The systems themselves can include things like a microphone, a transmitter, a receiver, and all of those pieces are considered a part of the auxiliary aids under the ADA. So hopefully that clarifies the difference between an ALS provided by the school and personal devices like a hearing aid or a cochlear implant. Okay, let's move on to the next slide. Reach out to us anytime, please. We are here for you. We also want to say thank you for being here, for your thoughtful questions. We really appreciated you sending questions in advance, and we wish we had more time with you. But as always, you can reach out to us anytime for information, any information you'd like. Kate, anything else? This is Kate. Thank you for joining us today. Please do continue to be in touch with any questions you may have. All right, hopefully the rest of your day is fantastic. Thank you.